Boldwood presents For Once in My Life, written by Sian O'Gorman and read by Caroline Lennon. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Merrion Square, in the heart of Georgian Dublin, was by far the most lovely area of this beautiful city. It was the 1st of June, and the square was at its resplendent best on this Friday afternoon. The trees in the park at the centre were in their full green glory, the flower beds a haze of colour, the playground full of children squealing, the benches filled with office workers, their faces to the sun, their coffee photocups and sandwiches beside them. High above the square, in a conference room on the top floor of advertising company Mulligan O'Leary, Kitty O'Sullivan glanced down at the verdant oasis below. Beside her, Alex was in full flow, pitching to the Department of Health a potential new fitness campaign for children. Kitty watched as hand-holding children from the small Montessori, which occupied one of the houses, dressed in boaters and striped shirts, snaked their way across the centre of the square. People were picnicking on the grass, sandwiches bought from the cool basement cafe. There was a fiddle player in the shade of a cherry tree, the sun dappling grass around him, the music wafting heavenward, all the way to Kitty. She was finding it hard to keep her mind on work, and mainly thinking of Dave and how he didn't seem content with his life. Just that morning, he had been lying in bed as Kitty had raced around getting dressed, tidying the house quickly. Because she knew that Dave wouldn't bother, when he had announced he was unhappy and wanted to find a new job. Unhappy? She'd queried, momentarily taken off balance. He'd nodded, or rather his nose, which poked out from the duvet, had moved up and down, which she'd taken to be a sign of acquiescence. Was he depressed or just down in the dumps? Dave hadn't been his old self for a long time and had retreated into early middle age, the grumpy young man who didn't like socialising or having any kind of fun. He'd lost his father 3 years earlier, which, understandably, had only compounded his decline. He needed something to get his mojo back, and Kitty had begun to wonder if they needed to make a more definite kind of commitment. Would getting married be something that might help him feel more secure? Kitty tuned back into the conference room. Alex was still talking confidently, explaining their idea for the Hop To It campaign. She was the chief copywriter in their team, and Kitty was her junior. Kitty had worked at Mulligan O'Leary for the last 5 years. Her skills lay in the honing of an idea and its essence, finding the perfect word and sentence that would bring it to life. And she was quite content that Alex took the lead, being so much better at public speaking than she was. Alex was tall, cool and queenly, her hair cut in a bob almost as sharp as her cheekbones, with heavy perfect makeup and not a hair out of place. Kitty was smaller, blonde with straight shoulder-length hair. Her suit's a slightly more high-street version of Alex's, but a softer face, blue eyes and small features. She was pretty to Alex's beauty. On the other side of Alex sat their newish team leader, Mary Rose, who was still on her 3-month probation. She nodded along, interested in everything Alex said, as though this was her first time hearing it all. Hughie, their graphic designer, was sitting on the other side of Kitty. He caught her eye, and with only the slightest twitch of his eyebrow, nearly made her laugh. In front of them were 3 grey-suited, sour-faced members of the Department of Health, one with a polished dome of a head, which reflected the light from the large windows. The brief had been to encourage children to exercise, and Hop To It was to be brought to all the junior schools in the country, linking up with sports days and summer camps. The mascot was a rabbit called Floppy Hopper, a character drawn by Hughie. "Hop to it," said Alex, managing to smile at everyone. "Will therefore be a perfect way to encourage children to move more and leave their phones behind." Kitty thought again of Dave, how things weren't working, and what she could do to make a change. They'd been together for 5 years, but since his father had died, he hadn't been himself. Or perhaps he hadn't been himself before then, but whenever it was, she was finding it harder and harder to remember the lovely Dave from their early days. Then he'd been sweet and fun, and although never outgoing or remotely gregarious, he had suited Kitty. Having someone to look after made her feel wanted and needed, and she felt nothing but affection for him. She planned to bring happiness from sadness, tidiness from disarray. Marriage, she thought, might bring him back to where he had been. And wasn't getting married the ultimate relationship tidying up? He was in a life slump, dealing with the fact that he wasn't achieving all those ambitions he'd once reeled off when they had first met. His own company, a certain salary, his own house with gravel driveway. He'd been derailed, and perhaps getting married would give him a solidity that would power him out of his slump. Kitty loved Dave, and was determined to do whatever it took to make him happy. Or at least, happier. Alex turned to Kitty and smiled. "I'm just going to hand you over to Kitty, who will take you through how we believe the rollout in schools should go." Kitty felt her stomach turn over with a lurch of nausea. Standing up and speaking had never become any easier over the years, and she much preferred to let others take the lead and the limelight. Creating order in life, from words and sentences to tidying and cleaning, was what she loved. And standing up in front of people was her very definition of chaos. When things were tidy, she felt safe and secure. Kitty got to her feet, somehow managed to smile, and began speaking. Even though she knew their pitch was good, she felt exposed and silly. 2 of the Department of Health team were nodding encouragingly, but the shiny-headed man was looking unimpressed, his arms folded across his chest, his nose scrunched sceptically. "It's a campaign which will make children feel they are part of a club," Kitty said. "And with the tokens and reward chart, they will want to run faster for longer, jump higher, skip, or even rollerblade even more." Her voice sounded ridiculous, high and tinny, nothing like Alex's low, confident tones. "Thank you for listening," she ended. "Any questions?" The 2 encouraging Department of Health bods nodded. "I love it," said one. "I like hoppy." "Floppy," said Hugh. "Oh, so do I," said the other. But the man with the crossed arms shook his shiny head. "It's missing something," he said, a finger to his lips. "Missing something," Alex said, as though to clarify that is what was said, rather than asking what was missing. "Yeah." The man sat back in his chair as though relaxing into the problem. "I'm not sure what it is, but something is missing." Alex leaned into the table. "We can work on it," she said smilingly. "We can refine and represent." The man looked at her. "I don't know what it is," he said, "but it just doesn't grab me." Alex looked over at Kitty, her face utterly blank. But Kitty knew she was devastated. If he didn't like it, then they hadn't won the pitch. The campaign would go to one of their rivals. The problem was, Kitty agreed with him. Something was missing. And, to be honest, there was always something missing, but that was normal. Kitty never produced a piece of work which she thought of as perfect. She had learned to just accept that she would never be 100% happy with the pitch. She was a perfectionist by nature, But she had realised over the years that work and relationships would never be as easy to control as the inside of her wardrobe, which was perfectly organised, or her food cupboard with its alphabetised spices. Later, when all the goodbyes and handshaking were done, and the Department of Health team had left, Kitty, Alex, Mary Rose and Hughie made their way back to their office. Alex was almost incredulous as she sat at her desk. He didn't like it. Only one of them didn't like it, said Mary Rose. The other two did. But Alex seemed unable to compute what had just happened. Just the previous month, she had won gold at the Irish Advertising Awards. Her third such prize. She wasn't used to losing. He said something was missing. Maybe some people can't see a good campaign when it is presented to them, said Alex. We worked on that for 6 weeks and I thought it was good. I think it was a good pitch, went on Kitty. And they loved Floppy. She smiled over at Hughie. He could have been cuter, though, said Hughie, adjusting his hair. I think the bow tie was a little too small. Mary Rose smiled at them. Let's see if we can use this as a learning experience, yes? Let's crack on and win the next one. She paused, perching on the edge of Kitty's desk. And it's a big one. Right, drum roll, Hughie. Hughie drummed 2 pencils on his desktop. Brings me back to school orchestra, he said. I was percussion. Until, of course, Cathal Magooly had a meltdown and got his mam up the school and said that if he was not given the drums, then he was going to have anxiety. Hughie shrugged. And that is how I ended up on the xylophone. Just 1 tune a year. The Bells, just before Silent Night. Still haven't got over it. Very touching, said Alex, but irrelevant to the fact we just lost a pitch. Something missing, she muttered, looking over at Kitty again. What on earth did he mean? That was the problem, Kitty thought. Wasn't there always something missing? And you just had to find it and fix it. Like the problem with her and Dave. Marriage was missing, and it would fix everything. Right, Mary Rose continued. Mr. Mulligan has emailed to say that we have been asked to pitch for a brand new international campaign. We have exactly 3 weeks to work on it. And, she paused for effect, the client is Welcome Ireland. There was a gasp from Hughie, and even Alex looked interested. I knew that would get you all excited, said Mary Rose. It's a huge international tourist campaign in every territory. We have to sell Ireland to the rest of the world. We're up against Jacinta Boyle and her team from DNG, and Luella Murphy and her team from Elevation. They are both brilliant teams, we know that, but this is a massive opportunity for us. Think you can do it? If we can work out what was missing last time, said Alex, then we might have a chance. Chapter 2. Kitty sat on the commuter train, taking her towards her home in Sandycove, just a half-hour away from the city centre, and travelled along the coast. She stared out of the window at the glittering, sparkling sea, the flash of the yacht sails, the seagulls with their huge wingspan, those beady eyes as they swooped on the headwinds. Her mind was full of 2 things: that day's failed pitch and her unhappy boyfriend. How would she fix it all? And what was the something missing? It felt as though if she found the answer to that, everything might fall into place. From Sandycove station she walked through the village, with its small shops, past the pub, where the Friday night drinkers spilled out onto the pavement, the noise of their chat drifting up in the air. It was one of the nicest villages in Ireland, she always thought. A busy, buzzy, beautiful place, with hanging baskets loaded with mauve and white lobelia and pink begonias. She knew most people and waved at Edith Waters, who ran the haberdashery in the village and was Shazza's landlady. And there was Killian Walsh, the owner of the Sandy Cove Arms Hotel, holding hands with Flora, just back from their honeymoon. And outside the island pub, people were laughing and chatting, Aperol spritzes in hands. There was a group of ladies with wet hair, who'd obviously been for a dip in the 40-foot. Dave wasn't a pub-goer, preferring to watch TV at home. Saves money, he'd say. But Kitty looked with a pang of longing, sensing that prickle of anticipation that she remembered feeling before a night out. When she'd met Dave, he'd worn such a long scarf that it had trailed on the ground, and for some reason it had made her feel quite protective over him. He'd been funnier in those days, and told her he'd tried out in the university open mic nights, and had even won the Most Surprisingly Funny award, which, as he reminded everyone, had been won by Dara O'Brien back in the old days. Buoyed by his success, the world of comedy his oyster, he even planned a show to take to Edinburgh. But as the date to pay his deposit drew closer, his nerve seemed to fade, and the show remained unwritten. Instead, he dedicated himself to his studies and planned on dominating the world of engineering, setting his sights on a big job in the States. But after graduation, those dreams faded. The scarves grew shorter, along with his ambitions. Kitty had tried to help over the years, but he batted her away, content to stay in, commenting on the world from the comfort of their sofa. Maybe she would help him find himself again, the two of them together, Kitty by his side. Her phone vibrated. Shazza, how was the pitch? Kitty texted back. Kitty, we didn't get it. Shazza, really? But I thought it was great. Kitty, something was missing, apparently. Shazza, you need a drink. Kitty, wish I could, but I said I would go home early. Shazza, ... Kitty, sorry. Shazza, don't worry. Have a nice evening. I have to go to a launch at the Sandy Cove Arms. A new local beer. It's a hard life. Kitty, love you. Shazza, love you too. Say hi to Dave. Kiss, kiss, kiss. Shazza had yet to meet Mr. Exactly Right, but had had several collisions with members of the male of the species, who were either emotionally unavailable or unhinged, or in one case, addicted to his vape, which he couldn't remove from his mouth, even during meals or going to the bathroom. It's just so unhygienic, Shazza had complained. And then she'd met a fellow journalist at the Irish Independent, and they'd fallen in love. We're proper together, Shazza had explained, as in actually together, accompanying each other to events. Finally, I have a +1. But it turned out he just wasn't that into her. She'd told Kitty, tearfully, sloshing wine in her glass, that he'd decided to get married, and it wasn't to Shazza. It was to Arabella Scott O'Brien, who was in charge of the horse racing section of the paper, and who hailed from very rich Kildare horsey family, and was always photographed at some god-awful race meet with a ridiculous fascinator on her head. Shazza had a penchant for leopard print, had long, unbrushed, highlighted blonde hair, and sometimes reminded Kitty of a stallion, its mane being blown in the wind. She had no time for prettiness or being quiet. She was loud and proud in every way, except after things had ended with her +1. You can't even tell which one's the horse, Shazza had wailed, her lack of feminist solidarity excused, due to extreme distress. In a fit of desperately needing to get far away from this man, now monikered Mr. Unmentionable, Shazza had handed in her notice, refused the extra money she'd been offered to stay and walked out. She was now editor of the Sandy Cove newsletter, dealing with community events, council happenings, and the latest lowdown in the local clubs and societies. But marriage, thought Kitty, was the only solution to her and Dave's relationship stasis. It was either that or separate, which sounded so much more chaotic. After seeing Shazza's life being upturned after her breakup, Kitty really couldn't face the same. Chapter 3. Hello, I'm home. Kitty stepped inside the hall as Romeo, her treasured black cat, who had 2 white socks on his back legs and a smudge of white on his face, bounded soundlessly down the stairs, making a beeline for her, winding his body around her ankles, purring delightedly as though he'd been waiting for her all day. She hung up her bag and linen jacket next to Dave's dead dad's winter coat, which he had taken to wearing, the collar up, looking like a man on his way to the betting shop. After the wedding, she thought, they would go on a honeymoon somewhere too warm to wear old winter coats, where they could drink a few cocktails and relax and set a new course for their life. She felt buoyant at the thought. She would come up with an itinerary for the travelling, plan everything far in advance, and leave no room for mishaps or mistakes. Dave might even enjoy it. In the living room, Dave was wearing another of his late father's clothes. A jumper which was so heavy and so scratchy that it made Kitty's skin itch all over. It had become Dave's comfort jumper, which he wore most of the time now, along, horrifyingly, with his father's old tweed cap. A couple of times, in the fading evening light, she'd walked into the room and almost had a heart attack, thinking it was the ghost of his dead father. Once, while wearing the jumper and cap, David tried to kiss her, and it was impossible to explain without hurting his feelings why this was abhorrent. There was another time, one chilly evening during the winter, when the boiler wasn't working, that he'd worn them in bed, even the cap. And all night, Kitty had slept on the very edge of the mattress, praying she wouldn't feel a wandering hand. She had thought that as the weather warmed, the hat, old cardigan and coat would be consigned to the wardrobe. But they still made their spectral appearance. But he was still obviously grieving, and who was she to say what grief should look like? But Dave and his father hadn't been all that close. He was much more of a mother's boy, taking her side when his father disappeared somewhere. Maureen, Dave's mother, was an intimidating woman, and Kitty often thought that she too would disappear from time to time if she was stuck with her for life. His mother was, in Kitty's opinion, an opinion she had never dared to breathe, an overbearing dragon, who hadn't liked Kitty from the moment she first laid eyes on her. She was a large woman who seemed to like to juxtapose herself against small things, almost to make herself seem even more imposing. She always carried a tiny handbag and wore shoes which looked uncomfortably insufficient. And now she was to be Kitty's mother-in-law-to-be, then she would have to find some way of taming this dragon. Perhaps the two of them would discover that they had more in common than they first thought. Perhaps they would end up being best friends. Dave looked up, his face half in shadow from the peak of the cap. It was like something from a horror film. If she hadn't known it was Dave, she would have run screaming from the house. Instead, she smiled what she hoped was a soothing smile. "I'll get your dinner on," she said in a calm voice. Dave needed love and support, and perhaps the old Dave would re-emerge. He had zero culinary skills whatsoever, having had Maureen cater to every whim. He was clueless in the kitchen, frequently setting fire to tea towels, or boiling pans dry, or burning food so thoroughly the saucepan was rendered unusable. They had come to the agreement that Kitty would be in charge of feeding them both. He was a vegetable refuser, and could only eat food with negative nutrients. It was a miracle he was still alive. But before she began cooking, she wanted to broach the proposed wedding. "Dave," she began, "look, I just wanted to suggest something that might be good for us. I just thought that perhaps we I don't know, perhaps we could discuss." He stared at her with glassy eyes. "Anyway," she stumbled on, I thought we could talk about getting married." Dave looked stunned, as though she had suggested listening to Ronan Keating's new album. I mean," she blundered, "it's just a thought. A change. It would mean that we would feel more committed to each other, safer, more secure. I thought that you, after your—" But Dave was shaking his head. "No." He looked up at her. "God, no." She hadn't planned on what to do if he refused her. But here she was, being refused by a man in his dead dad's jumper, who hadn't ever eaten a vegetable in his life. And worse, so much worse, was how repulsed he was by the very thought of marrying her. "Dave," she began. And then she noticed her little rolling suitcase was packed. "I've made a decision," he said. "I'm going to Mam's." At least he wasn't throwing her out, which was a relief. But when had she ever stopped him from going to his mother's? Despite the fact Maureen had never liked Kitty and acted as though she and Dave were in a special club of two. "How long will you be?" His pale face reddened, eyebrows furrowed. "There you go again. Controlling me. I'm going to Mam's to sort my head out. See what I want from life." Kitty wondered how exactly to respond. This was perhaps one of the stages of Dave's grieving process, except she couldn't remember which one. Was abandonment one? "You keep pressurising me," he went on. "You keep going on about marriage." "I don't," she said. I mean, once I brought it up, ages ago, and asked if it was something you would consider doing." "You proposed," he said. "That's a proposal. It's pressurising." "I think," she said, "that at the time you said we probably would. It definitely wasn't a proposal, more of a testing out the waters, seeing if we are on the same page." "Oh, there you go again," he snapped, correcting me, being superior. Talk about kicking a man when he's down. "Which is why I'm going to Mam's. She's expecting me. Put my electric blanket on and everything." Slightly shell-shocked, Kitty tried to speak. "Dave, listen, I'm sorry if you felt as though I put you under any pressure or—" "Oh, sorry if I felt the pressure. Not admitting you did." He reached behind the sofa and pulled his old wheelie case towards him. Kitty's brain was working overtime as she tried to catch up with this turn of events. "Go to your Mam's, if that makes you feel better. How long are you going for?" "Not sure," he said stiffly, looking away, as though the sight of her offended him. "It's just too much pressure," he said in a plaintive voice. "All the time. Marriage, tidying up. What's next? A child?" Well, if she was honest with herself, she hadn't given it enough thought, as it had always been something she'd always assumed was in the far-off distance. "Jesus!" He slapped his hand against his forehead. "There you go again. Pressure. I don't want to get married," he shouted, wrestling with the telescopic handle of his suitcase. "Or at least, I'm not sure if I want to get married. Mam says I'm far too young. I'm 32, for God's sake, and in man years, that's really young these days." Kitty wasn't sure quite what he meant by man years, or why his mother was involved in any of this, but she managed to remind herself to stay focused and that this was a serious discussion. Dave was struggling and needed love and support. She loved him, did she not? They had lived together happily for years, hadn't they? Well, not happily exactly. But wasn't happiness overrated anyway? Contentment was what was important, and she and Dave had been content for a long time now, and she couldn't imagine a life beyond him. Having seen the horse whisperer, Kitty knew the best thing to do was not to make sudden movements or speak too loudly. "It's okay," she said. "You go to your mother's and—" She paused. How should she describe this situation without causing more offence? "And sort your head out." "Yes," he said. "I need to go to Mam's, where zero pressure is putting me whatsoever." He managed to pull up the suitcase handle, almost falling backwards as it snapped into position. "Well, I think it's a good idea," said Kitty carefully. "Give you a break, and you can come back when you are ready." There was a beep from outside before she could say anything else, and Dave picked up his case and went to the door, taking his dad's coat from the hook and swinging it around his shoulders. "There's Mam now," he said, opening the door. Maureen loomed behind the steering wheel of her tiny Renault Clio. "When will you be back?" asked Kitty. Dave shrugged. "When I've decided what I want from life. Mam doesn't put pressure on me. She knows I can only eat chips and not much else. She doesn't buy own-brand ketchup and waits to see if I can tell the difference." He glared at her. "That was once," she protested, "years ago, and you were able to tell the difference." "Exactly." He opened his mouth to say something and then closed it again. He dashed off to the passenger side of the Renault Clio, and just as he pulled the door closed, and even before he had managed to put the seatbelt on, the car skidded off down the road, leaving just a pile of swirling dust. Chapter 4. The following morning, Kitty woke with a very clear sensation that all was not well with the world. It took her a few moments of anxiously sorting through her Rolodex of memories to recall what it was exactly. And when she found it, her heart sank even further. Dave was gone. It explained the space in the bed beside her, the quiet of the house, the lack of someone snoring loudly or watching a blaring television. Everything felt eerily empty and quiet. It was better when Dave was around, because there was something comforting about knowing that there was someone in the world who had shaped their life to fit yours, that they were your person, and you were theirs, and that your future was laid out like a yellow brick road for the two of you to skip along together to Oz, or wherever. But now, lying in bed, Kitty had never felt so alone. She missed Dave, all of him, even the awful bits, such as his weird nostril breathing, the way he left his clothes on the floor, or had breakfast in bed, so there were always crumbs. And why were crumbs always so sharp? But he was a good person. Dave never harmed anyone. He was a sensitive man who was going through a difficult time, and she hadn't always been the most brilliant partner. Just the other evening, she had told him that she was fed up with picking up his clothes off the floor. "What do you expect me to do about it?" he had said grumpily, drinking the milk from his cornflakes straight from the bowl. "Pick them up?" "What's the point?" he'd said. "They're only going to end back there soon enough." "Because clothes don't belong on the floor, and they make the room look messy." He had shaken his head. "But why worry about it? They're only clothes. They're not doing any harm. Stop being so uptight." Of course he was right. They were only clothes, and she was uptight. When Dave came back, she would show him that she was willing to not put pressure on him about anything. Marriage, clothes on the floor, his monochrome diet. Yes, he was somewhat flawed. lazy and a bit depressing to be around, but she couldn't abandon him or give up on him, not when there was still a chance to make everything better. She knew what it was like to feel abandoned and given up upon, and she didn't want to do that to Dave. Kitty's parents' marriage had ended when Kitty was 5, and from then on, her father, Billy, would take Kitty out every Saturday. They were usually boring days, spent watching the local football team, the Sandy Cove Seafarers, and then they'd go to a shabby local cafe on the seafront for hot chocolate, which was always Kitty's favourite bit. But when he moved to the States to coach a local team when she was in her early teens, their contact lapsed, and they never quite found each other again. Billy moved back to Sandy Cove a few years earlier and lived in a cottage in the centre of the village. He was working at least 3 jobs, as far as Kitty could tell. There was his early morning shift as a postman, then the morning sandwich-making session at the bakery, and then some evening coaching at the Sandy Cove Seafarers. Kitty felt a swirl of sadness that their relationship was so insubstantial. She loved him, but they had little in common. It was complicated. Her most loyal companion wasn't a human. It was Romeo. But he was nowhere to be seen. Normally, by this time in the morning, he had returned from his nighttime prowl around the mean streets of Sandy Cove and had made his way through his cat flap, across the kitchen, through the living room, up the stairs, pushing open the bedroom door with his head, and then hopping, soundlessly as though on strings, onto the end of the bed, where he would sleep off his night on the tiles. Except he too was gone. The house was still, empty, with no heartbeat except her own. Kitty felt sick. She pulled on her dressing gown, and in a few swift steps was heading down the stairs, barely able to call his name. She pushed open the door of the kitchen, and she almost cried in relief because there he was, curled up in the corner, on the warm patch over the hot water pipe below. He was fine, just fast asleep, his eyes closed, looking just like the kitten she had brought home all those years ago, his small chest trembling with each breath. "Oh, Romeo," she said, "you gave me a fright. Why didn't you come upstairs?" She began filling the kettle, thinking of Dave, and that soon, when he returned, she would be so much better. She would even make him his bowl of cornflakes, and she wouldn't have to look away when he tipped the milk into his mouth. She had to change, she really did. "I do, don't I, Romeo?" Kitty said. "I have to change, be a better person." She went to the fridge for the milk. "You see," she went on, "he knows me, and I know him, and—" She glanced at Romeo again, and he'd shifted a little, revealing his right ear. But it was bleeding. Kitty dropped to her knees to examine it. A bite had been taken out of Romeo's ear. "Oh, Romeo!" Kitty gently touched the area around it as Romeo looked back at her, his tiger eyes sad and baleful. Aged 13, he was an old man cat and didn't deserve this kind of violence. There was only one cat who could be responsible. Timmy, the neighbour's terrifying tabby, which hissed and snarled at everyone. Cats, dogs and humans. He'd attacked Romeo before, but not for a long time. And then Romeo had been sprightlier, far more able to dodge the claws. "We'll have to go to the vet's," she said. "I know you hate your carrier, but there's no other way." She usually went to one in Dunleary, but they'd been closed for the last few months, while the owner was on sabbatical in Thailand. "Seeing the world, Kitty," she had told her, when Romeo was last in for his shots. "Life is short, and I've had enough of this weather and this humdrum life. I'm off to have fun." Kitty found the number of the other vets and dialed. "Good morning," said the receptionist. "Sandy Cove Veterinary Surgery and Day Hospital. Your pet is our passion. How may I help you?" "My cat has been attacked by another cat," said Kitty. "His ear has been bitten." "Let me see." The receptionist seemed to talk through her nose. "We have a cancellation in 15 minutes. Can you pop down?" "Yes." "Name of cat?" "Romeo O'Sullivan." "See you in 15 minutes." Kitty carried Romeo in his special carrier, her arm aching, her heart almost as heavy as Romeo, and finally put him down beside the desk, where the receptionist chattered to someone with an energetic chihuahua who was twisting the lead around her legs as though maypole dancing. "Prof. Sweetman is such a great addition to the practice," the receptionist was saying. "We're so honoured to have him." The woman with the chihuahua nodded. "He's magnificent," she said. "Cross between Pierce Brosnan and George Clooney in his Eeyore days. It's the scrubs, I think, and the dark eyebrows. I am a sucker for eyebrows. Anyway, you know when he operated on Chicolito 6 weeks ago, after he'd swallowed a sock belonging to my husband?" The receptionist glanced at Kitty. "Be with you in a second," she said, before resuming her conversation. "Chicolito, the poor thingeen, was at death's door," carried on the woman. "But the professor worked his magic. We're just so lucky that he wanted to work in practice again after being in academia," said the receptionist. "I knew his brother," said the woman with a sigh. "The middle one. Patrick, wasn't it? Such a sad time for the family. The mother was beside herself." Kitty stared into the carrier at Romeo. He was still awake and staring out at her, looking not unlike an ailing Victorian poet. "Poor Romeo," she whispered into him. "He has one of those bedside manners that one could only dream about," went on the woman. "Honestly, little Chicolito adored him. And his voice. You could drift off to it. He should be doing those audiobooks." "Meditation apps," agreed the receptionist, nodding. "He'd be perfect." "I'll say goodbye and let you get on," said the woman. "Sorry to keep you." "You're not keeping me," replied the receptionist. "Sure am I just sitting here all day." "See you, Noreen. Look after yourself, yes? Don't be rushing around like a headless hen like you always do." Finally, she turned to Kitty. "Take a seat in the waiting area. The vet will call you shortly." Kitty and Romeo, still in his carrier, waited on a long bench, where Kitty read the terrifying posters on the wall, which warned of horrifying diseases, with images of the most horrific-looking parasites with teeth and the kind of legs which could scuttle about. It made being attacked by Timmy the tabby look almost benign. "Romeo O'Sullivan?" called a voice. On the back of the conversation she'd heard, Kitty braced herself for an Adonis to emerge. Except Professor Sweetman was much, much older than she had imagined. Small, nearly elderly, with a white beard and a rounded stomach. He looked more like Santa Claus than George Clooney. But he knew what he was doing, and he was so sweet and gentle with Romeo, who needed 3 stitches in his ear, a tetanus shot, and a course of antibiotics. Professor Sweetman placed him gently back into the carrier afterwards. "There you go, old man." Kitty smiled and shook his hand. "Thank you, Professor Sweetman." The man laughed. "Professor Sweetman? I haven't been elevated to that level. The eminent professor is at Trinity College today giving a lecture. We're job sharing at the moment. I'm Joseph Kelly. I've had this practice for the last 30 years. And when I had my stent put in and decided to take a step back, the stars aligned because," he chuckled again, "Professor Sweetman said he missed working with the animals. He oscillates between here and Trinity, while I oscillate between here and the golf course." He picked up Romeo's carrier and brought it out to reception. "Now," he said to Kitty, handing it to her, "watch this little fella, won't you? A scare like he had can be traumatic for older felines. He needs to stay indoors and enjoy his semi-retirement, just like me." At home, Kitty placed Romeo in his bed. covered with her cashmere scarf, filled his water bowl and let him sleep it off. "Just stay away from that Timmy," she warned. "You're too old to be off all night. Stay at home, OK?" Her phone vibrated. "Dave?" She bounded over, wondering if he'd changed his mind and he was coming home. But it was her mother, Catherine, on the family WhatsApp group, wishing her sister, Kitty's Aunt Annie, a happy birthday. Mum: "Happy birthday, Annie." Kitty: "Happy birthday to the world's best aunt." Annie: "Thank you, my lovely girls. Happy birthday to me. Have just exited the hot tub. About to join an online spin class, and then for brunch with the girls. See you both later for champers." Annie certainly had a far more fun life than anyone Kitty knew, even more than the levels of fun Shazza was proposing. It just seemed so unfair that out of two sisters, one was having all the fun. Chapter 5. Aunt Annie waved as she parked her duck-egg Fiat 500, reversing repeatedly in and out, edging closer to the pavement, at increments of what seemed like a millimetre at a time. Finally, Annie turned off the engine before exiting the microcar like a model from the 1950s. Annie looked radiant, her gym leggings matching the colour of her car and her nail varnish. And she smelled of Britney Spears' Fantasy, her signature fragrance. "I've just booked a girls' holiday to Ibiza," enthused Annie. "Have to celebrate being 21 again somehow." Annie looked a full decade younger than her older sister, Catherine, Kitty's mother, even though there were only 2 years between them. Annie always brought life and soul to family occasions, always insisting on a glass of something sparkling. Being unencumbered by husbands, children, or even pets, she was a woman who seemed not to have a care in the world. Her job, as a receptionist at the local Fiat showroom, seemed to be a mere extension of her social life. Any time Kitty called in, Annie would be in deep conversation, emitting breathless utterances and gasps at the news being shared. She never asked how Kitty's life was going, and didn't seem interested in much beyond her own extra fun, super exuberant life. That was just the way she was. Not everyone could be bothered hearing how you were, not when there was gossip to impart. And today it particularly suited Kitty, because she wasn't quite ready to try to explain away Dave's sabbatical. Annie poked her arm into Kitty's and marched her through the small wrought iron gate, up the path to the front door. "I'll leave the car here," she said to Kitty. "Pick it up in the morning. Need to celebrate my big day." She rang the doorbell. "What do you think of my brows?" She twisted her face so Kitty could get a good look. "Hollywood mega brows, meant to define the face, enhance my cheekbones and disguise the droopy lids. Magda in the salon says it makes me look as if I'm in my 40s. What do you think?" Kitty was about to agree when the door was answered by her mother. "Happy birthday to me!" exclaimed Annie giddily, making Catherine laugh, as she always did. The two sisters were so different. Catherine, who worked in a high-powered career, a single mother, who never went away with friends for alcohol-fueled weekends, and Annie, who lived in the here and now, whose only real concern was with having fun. Sometimes Kitty looked at her mother, who had risen at 5:30 a.m. every morning, gone to the office, returned at 6:30 p.m. to cook dinner, and later resumed her work at the kitchen table, and wondered if she would have been happier if she too had disappeared sporadically to the Balearics. For the last 3 decades, Catherine had worked for a bathroom warehouse firm, rising to the heights of deputy chairperson. And now, with the retirement of the very head of the company, she had been given every reason to believe that she was next in line to take over. Finally, she would receive the recognition she deserved, a reward for her excellence and competence. Kitty was planning a little gathering when Catherine's promotion was official, which should be imminent. Catherine looked at Annie and Kitty in turn. "You look tired," she said to her daughter. "Have you been sleeping?" "I'm fine," insisted Kitty, smiling at Catherine. But she was thinking about what she could or would say to Dave. At work, she always chanced upon the right word, but she couldn't find them for Dave. What could she say to make him come back and give her another chance? How could she prove that she wasn't pressurising without pressurising him? It was impossible. Life without Dave seemed wrong somehow. They had been together so long that the thought of being on her own was terrifying. Her only home comfort was lovely Romeo, and she'd left him that morning with his head on his pink velvet pillow, blanket tucked around his little body, ear bandaged like Van Gogh, and a look in his face as though to say, "Sorry for all this trouble." She'd kissed him goodbye, thinking that she would be far more lost if Romeo left her than if Dave did. And then she'd stopped, wondering if that was how she really felt. It was just, she reasoned, Romeo was so easy to love, and the fact that Romeo loved her back, which with cats was never a guarantee, made it even better. "I'm fine," Kitty now insisted to her mother, dismissing all those troublesome thoughts of Dave and Romeo. "Anyway, hadn't we better get this party started?" "Woohoo!" Annie pulled on an imaginary train horn. They sat at the table in the small kitchen and sang Happy Birthday to Annie, and then clinked their glasses of champagne. "So, you're nearly catching up with me," said Catherine. "Welcome to your 7th decade." "7th?" Annie looked puzzled. "Don't you mean 6th? Anyway, I have the teeth of a much younger woman. Honestly, going to Budapest for my veneers was probably the best money I ever spent." She glinted her teeth at Catherine. "Well, your money, which I will pay back just as soon as I can." "No need." Catherine brushed it away. Annie began to tell them about her preparations for Ibiza. So, spray tan, extra dark, 3 caftans of varying length, full body hair removal. "Full body," said Catherine, raising one eyebrow. Annie nodded. "Of course. And, well, I was thinking of getting another tattoo while I was there. Something which encapsulates my life's journey so far." She took another sip of her champagne. "Something like, 'Life is a roller coaster.'" She stopped. "Or maybe your names, Catherine and Kitty." Catherine laughed. "Please do not," she said. "Have some silly phrase drawn on, but our names would be just awful." For a moment, Annie looked hurt. "But you're my family." "Yes, of course we are, but we don't need to be tattooed on your leg." "It was going to be my forearm." Annie was beginning to smile as well. "What about some birthday cake?" said Catherine. "That might take your mind off tattoos." She picked up the cake knife and began slicing it into wedges. "Does it have many carbs?" asked Annie, eyeing the chocolate icing, "because I'm currently low-carbing. And before you two say anything, fizz doesn't count." "I'll have a slice." Kitty hadn't been saying very much, just trying to smile along and act as though everything was entirely normal. One thing she couldn't do was go low-carb. Sugar was going to be the one thing that might get her through the next few weeks. Surely it couldn't be longer before Dave came home. She could feel a slight panic beginning to rise, but she smiled at her mother as she took the plate with a slice of the chocolate ganache. "You know," said Annie, "I think I will high-carb today, as it's my big day. I'll have that one with the icing, that big piece there." Catherine laughed again. But Kitty found herself thinking that Annie never held parties for Catherine, or ever remembered her birthday. And as she had never had any spare money, there were never Christmas presents either. But Catherine never seemed to mind, happy to just have her younger sister around. "So," Kitty said, "you should get the news this week? Your promotion?" Catherine nodded. "I think there's going to be an announcement on Wednesday. Mr. O'Neill has booked Thursday and Friday off, so Wednesday will be his last day. My sister, the chairperson, said Annie. Or are you CEO? Chief, anyway. Who'd have thought it? You are always the chief of our family. Pick up my pieces, sort out my bits, the yin to my yang, the champagne flute to my fizz. I don't know what I would do without you. She raised her glass. Thank you, Annie, said Catherine. Now, more cake. And you can take some home with you if you're high carbing.